as we're very excited about season 2. It is weird to say season 2.
It's so
especially
weird,
because
like we're professionals or something.
I know. If they only knew how much we were half-assing this whole thing, Varsha, people would be terribly disappointed in us.
Terribly disappointed, but also they would realize how much fun it is, and everybody should do webcasts, specifically with alcohol. I don't know if anybody in my department actually knows that I'm doing this, except for somebody from my department who's going to do an interview with us. But I feel like if they find out, they'd be like, yeah, that's Varsha. That makes sense.
Yeah, I had a horrifying moment very early on, in which I saw in the registrations my dean, who is a historian. And then she sent me a note afterwards, said like, this is phenomenal. This is fantastic afterwards. So I felt like after that, cool. Like, whatever. It's fine. So I hope I'm not going to get in trouble. You know, I'm wearing Virginia Tech logo here. So, because it is just so ridiculously cold in Virginia right now. I was going to dress up, but my little snood and my sweatshirt on.
Yeah. So somebody called Ted has just asked us to do a sea shanty at the end of this. I cannot sing, but if I could sing, I would love to do a rendition of Wellerman, because have you seen sea shanty TikTok, Sarah?
I love sea shanty TikTok, and I have to say, as a historian, I would be honored to observe the two of you and
Oh my God, we should do a sea shanty drinking with historians, because that would be absolutely amazing. Oh, it looks like Rachel's here. Great, because we were just about going, and I'm glad she's here. So
yeah. So welcome to season 2, participants. This is season 2 of Drinking with Historians. Today our guest is Sara Georgini, but before we get to that, I just wanted to introduce Rachael, who is our awesome research assistant. She's going to be like handling the Q&A, making sure to flag really cool questions for us. So if you have questions, make sure to put in the Q&A and Rachael will notice them. Rachael, you could say hi to everybody.
Hi. Sorry,
Rachael, you're an art history PhD student, right?
Yeah.
Art history PhD.
Rachel. In what period, Rachel?
Medieval, early medieval.
Medieval, yay!
And,
go Middle Ages. Okay.
And Rachael also used to be a bartender, so she is aware that alcohol is a thing. So it's great. Great.
As opposed to the rest of America, right? That has no idea that alcohol is a thing, right? So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Rachael is going to disappear for a moment, but we're so happy and excited that she'll be joining us. To be seeing much more of her, of course, going forward. If you have any problems with the Drinking with Historians Twitter now, it's her, so don't yell at us. It's all Rachael. So
thank you.
So I'm taking on the supervision thing. I think really good. I'm just immediately throwing our assistant under the bus, which is great. So we're gonna do this, and so we'll get right to it since we've been just talking. I'm so excited, I just keep talking. But I want to introduce our guest. We are so pleased to be joined by Dr. Sara Georgini, who took her PhD from Boston University and is now the executive director, the series editor of the John Adams papers for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And we have to immediately get to the most important, the most pressing, the best question that we've come up with to ask on Drinking with Historians, which is, Sarah, what are you drinking?
Hi, and welcome everyone. I am drinking very sensible green tea, because like many of you, I have a writing deadline. Maybe it's a book review that's still due tonight.
Wow, fun.
Book reviews, love it. So what about you, Varsha? What are you drinking?
I was initially going to drink Japanese whiskey, but then I thought, we have a transition of power coming up. So I decided to become patriotic and drink bourbon. This is 1792. It's the Bottled and Bond. The reason I like it is because you can really smell the vanilla when you drink it. So that's what I'm drinking, neat.
Excellent. So
what about you, Matt?
I am the fancy boy always, right? Of the so I've made myself a cocktail. I've made a Black Manhattan, which I think I've made before, which is a mix of some rye, some Italian Amaro called Averna, this kind of rich, velvety Amaro, and then some orange bitters and Angostura bitters, and it's just absolutely delicious. It's a nice digestive after I wolf down some food. And then I have some Angel's Envy rye, which is just absolutely phenomenal. Like it's so caramel. It's like drinking like liquory sugar, and it's absolutely amazing. So I'm going to get to that afterwards. So,
Yeah.
But
so I guess we'll just get started. You know, I don't know if people have been paying attention. I don't know if Sarah, if you've been paying attention. There have been things going on in America, and there's been something that's just been like, it's like a buzzword, transition of power over and over again. And like every single person on TV, every journalist is like, America is renowned for its transition of power. You recently wrote, I think last year, you wrote an article for Smithsonian about the 1800 transition of power, which for some historians call the revolution of 1800, right? Because it's the first time two federalists, or you know, a federalist president from one party transitions power to a Republican president, Thomas Jefferson. So my question is, what does a transition of power supposed to look like? And have we been going through a peaceful one recently? You know, what can we learn from the past?
So let's dive into that election of 1800 for a minute, because I think there's some really useful lessons for all of us in it about the peaceful transfer of power. That's not something that we invented in America. It is something that really engraves America in the world's mind as a democracy at that moment. Because as you just kind of sketched out for us, you have a transfer of power between two parties, right? So you have John Adams Federalists, and you have the Democratic Republicans with Thomas Jefferson in the lead. And you have an election that is deadlocked then, right, between Jefferson and New York's Aaron Burr, who will go on to infamy of a different sort in another couple of years. But it goes right into the House, right? And it takes 36 ballots and 6 days of really confusion and concern on the part of the legislature and the people and the press to sort it all out. So there's a lot of lessons there about kind of the federal government working, the system working despite widespread chaos and concern. And I think that's something for us to bear in mind at this time. Now, it certainly wouldn't be easy to be John Adams in the moment when he knows he's lost. And that moment comes sooner than we think. He has a good sense by the middle of December 1799 that the votes are not going to click his way. And so he just kind of awkwardly sits and waits as power drifts away. He doesn't tweet, but he does send letters home talking about his disappointment, right? So if we think about the 18th century version of how presidents communicate, he is kind of upset. He says, my little bark has been upset. There's been a storm, the squall of lightning. He's thinking about the political change. And I'm really fascinated by this analogy because when Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans come into power finally, one of the first letters that Jefferson writes is, you know, our ship has come into port and now we have to see what we do next. So this language and this imagery that they use about, you know, storms and changes in the air, and it's set against this really dramatic backdrop of a system testing itself. There's a lot that we could look at there and say, a peaceful transfer of power was possible. So what would a peaceful transfer of power look like? What has it looked like for the last 2 centuries? Administrations talk to each other, right? The presidency, incoming and outgoing, there's a sense of the legacy that an outgoing president wants to build, whether it's a nonprofit organization or a library or to write their memoirs. We have some sense of where they're headed into history, and we have some sense of the history that might be unfolding with the new administration. So all centuries ago, it shouldn't look exactly like it did in 1800. So we need to think about that and kind of the possibilities for political change against that kind of backdrop. So it's a system testing itself in 1800. We're seeing that test again. We're always going to see it because that's what a democracy does.
So just a quick follow-up. One of the major issues that we've had with this election is people claiming that, you know, the votes are not correct or there's like illegal votes out there. In the election of 1800, especially since it was thrown to the House, were there voters? I know in 1800, the voters were mainly white men with property. Were there voters who thought, specifically Federalists, who thought this was not anti-democratic, but like anti-American? Were they attempting to change the course of the election after it was clear it had to be thrown to the House, or was there outrage that it would have to be thrown to the House?
Well, I think they want to see the system move forward. So if the constitutional system that they put into place, which is throw it to the House, is not great, but it's something, they're more interested in progress than really hampering it. And it's interesting, you put your finger on something that's so important. I was thinking about this in the context of the 19th century, really. About how violent elections are, how difficult it is to vote, how many contested elections that we know about come out of the 19th century and that story, and just how challenging it was to vote at all. And I think that's something to kind of bear in mind, even as we think about the politicians and how they're put into power and what agendas they may come up with along the way. Just the sheer history of voting in America and how much it has changed is something to think about. And I think it's something that we're talking about more and more. We've seen a big spotlight on voter suppression in the past couple of years and efforts to turn that around. We've seen a lot of interest in the census and how areas are redistricted. These are all important things for historians to pay attention to. And again, they look very different in 1800 than they do now. So I think that kind of gets to some of your question.
Yeah. Could I ask kind of a logistical question again? Like I'm a simple medievalist. Like anything after 1200 is a little bit confusing for me. So what was like in the late 18th, early 19th century, as we're thinking about kind of one of these first transitions of power, like what was voting like? Like how did you vote? I mean, like as you mentioned, like we talked about voter suppression, and as many commentators have pointed out very recently, the expansion of the franchise has been something that we've been moving towards, and it's actually kind of ahistorical in some ways, right? It's not something that like expanding the franchise to everybody is not something that historically has ever happened. So what did it mean to vote, right, in say in 1800?
Mm-hmm. So really the people to pay attention to are your presidential electors. And much like today, it turns out that you have different state legislators with different ways of choosing those people. And those were really the people to watch. They collect your votes and they're the ones who present them. In the 19th century, it's a little feistier, the actual voting experience. You have a colored ticket that you would clip out of a newspaper. You would bring it very visibly, right, to your local voting area and drop it off there. It wasn't so much of a secret ballot, maybe, is how it felt. And you could really be subject to intimidation at that moment. We had a fantastic talk about contested elections about a week or so ago with the Massachusetts Historical Society. Just a wonderful lineup of folks, Ted Widmer, Joanne Freeman, Peter Onif, Eric Alexander, and Rachel Sheldon, talking about these contested elections and the experience of voting. And I was so struck by something Rachel was talking about, which was the shoulder hitters, the people who would kind of come up and physically intimidate you while voting in the 19th century, while dropping off your ticket. So that's certainly something that's an interesting cultural experience to keep in mind when we think about all of the 20th and 21st century, you know, whether it's hanging chads or, you know, the screens or those little kind of Sharpie bubbles that I'm pretty sure I never get quite right. Things like that have really changed over time. So this process of voting has evolved as well in tandem with the American political system. And political parties have always found a way to kind of guide that change and to be a part of it. And that's worth thinking about.
So speaking of political parties, another recent discussion that's been happening a lot is what is going to happen to the Republican Party now that, you know, we've had such an outsized figure sort of take control of it for 4 years. And I'm reminded of what sort of happened to the Federalist Party by the time I think Madison leaves office, right? So I guess my question is, what was the state of the Federalist Party, you know, when John Adams was president, and what can Republicans or Democrats learn from the slow death of the Federalist Party? In your opinion?
It's a slow and painful death, right? Because a lot of it has to do with the fact that John Adams is, and I think James Grant has nailed this in his biography title, he's a party of one. He is not interested in being a party leader. And because of that, you know, you have someone like an Alexander Hamilton who comes in electioneering, who undercuts him at every opportunity, who really splinters the party. And it's interesting to see, but the Federalist Party, you know, they're out of power. They never had the congressional majority that they'd had since the beginning of the tripartite federal government system with the Constitution. They never have that again. They're lost after 1800, and they are just kind of in a downward spiral on multiple fronts. And so I think that's something to look out for, that kind of what we very glossily refer to as party cleavage, when we talk about it today, is something that's a splintering, a fracturing. There's not a lot of common grounds that they can find. And it's worth thinking about, I think, for anyone involved in a political party today, no matter what it may be, which is, what are the rallying points of your ideology? How are you communicating that ideology through the press to people? Kind of, where are your channels of communication? Quite literally, thinking about that. And then thinking about connecting to the other party, right? So, any opportunity for bipartisanship, things like that. Where do you connect on that? All things for them to think about, that the Federalists could have done probably a better job of thinking about, but are just kind of too internally riven to do so.
Well, that kind of gets at a question that I had as you were thinking of as you were talking, is so if the Federalist Party is experiencing this long, slow death, like, is it lamented? Is it clear that the Federalist Party is dying? Or is it one of those things where you don't realize what a substantive change, in this case, to political parties in the United States, is happening until it actually happens?
I think it depends where you are. I mean, I think
Sure.
so. Regional affiliation, certainly the New England stronghold of Federalists, it's of great concern. When John Quincy Adams is kind of training up for his very short stint in the Senate, and then coming back to serve as the Secretary of State. I mean, these are things that he's thinking about. It's always on their minds. But I mean, there's also a great concern in early America, and this is something that John Adams is particularly strident on, is that party strife is what will really sink this republic before it gets going. This is the real death knell, is when you have too much partisanship, because it means that nothing gets done, and the original kind of principles that American revolutionaries fought for are not at all ever going to be realized. So there's real concern about partisanship in general, and how that contributes to the work of citizenship. And certainly the Federalist decline, part of it.
So moving on to John Adams, the human being, when I think of John Adams, I don't think of his presidential portrait or it's the $2 bill, right, that nobody ever sees anymore. I think of Paul Giamatti, because that was like all I remember. I swear, all I remember of John Adams is learning about the Alien and Sedition Acts and how it was horrible. Paul Giamatti in the series Adams, and how John Adams, the reason I sort of found him interesting is because he defends a bunch of British soldiers in 1770, right, for the Boston Massacre. So I guess my question is, what was John Adams like, and why did you choose to study John Adams the first? Not his son, but
John Adams the first. Oh, the tinge of monarchy. You heard that.
He would like that. Let's be honest. He would enjoy that.
He got called a lot of names, and we can talk about what those nicknames were at the next follow-up question if you want. So why study him? Well, because he was a lifelong student of government. So here was someone who really reached back to medieval and Renaissance examples to understand how republics rise and fall some more. Here's someone who really had to live his life as first a British citizen and then an American citizen, and figure out what both of those categories looked like. He's someone who has just an extraordinary legal mind, and a grasp on the law as a moral corrective. This was a very popular kind of 18th century idea that if you were a lawyer, you were fixing society's ills. This was something that he thought a great deal about. And just because, well, he's Abigail's husband, right? Let's call it what it is. If you can possibly bring in another voice to understand her mind and her political thought, which is deep and sometimes contrasts with his and is rich and is complex, then I'm all for it. So a good deal of studying John Adams is getting to know his mind and his friends and his frenemies and everyone in between. And that really helps you understand, I think, the different perspectives to which people came to revolution, not always easily, and then what they did after it, which is kind of like the big, like, you know, he's not a young guy when he becomes president. Every job that he has along the way, especially being minister to Great Britain, especially being vice president, which means he'll be president of the Senate, even being president, every time he thinks he's hit his dream job, he's kind of, you know, disappointed. And he has to kind of grapple with what he originally wanted to do versus, you know, I don't know what was happening around him. So when I look at John Adams, I think about the struggle in that revolutionary era that many people faced between theory and practice. It's one thing to say a bunch of things and go to revolution. It's another thing to then have to live up to it and do the job afterward. And I think his life is a constant tension. And that tension does play out in a remarkably entertaining HBO miniseries as well. Yes.
So, kind of, I was really struck by something you said about kind of getting at the kind of the inner lives, and especially of Abigail, right? And I know, kind of as series editor of the Adams paper, you love all your sources equally, but like, what's the source that you found? Like, what is the document that you kind of come back to that's the most exciting for you in revealing something about either Abigail or John or somebody else in the family?
Well, I always say that if you're writing political history and there's no women in it, you're missing half the story. So I want to just emphasize how important it is to kind of bring in not just Abigail's view, but also, you know, her daughter-in-law, Louisa Catherine, or her daughter, Nabby, or her friends, Mercy Otis Warren and Hannah Phillips Cushing, or Margaret Bayard Smith, or I could name a whole more longer list of women that we could add in there.
There were women in the 18th century?
Notify the 1776 commission. I don't think they're aware of this.
They should. I'm going to go get my
Adams
phone.
papers
Sorry,
are
go ahead.
250,000 manuscript pages, and they are open for research on this and many more subjects. But if I had to pick out of those 250,000 manuscript pages, I'm going to go with a favorite that maybe a lot of people know, which is Abigail's letter to John shortly after the British have left Boston. They've evacuated in April 1776, and it is her Remember the Ladies letter.
Yes, it's my favorite. I love that letter.
All right, Varsha, I'm going to do what I usually do when folks visit the NHS. Why is that your favorite?
Because it's very clear. When I read it, I think I read it in high school, or maybe it was first year of college. I remember reading it just because I got really into John Adams and Abigail Adams' like marriage. And the reason it's my favorite is because it's so clear that she is unafraid of disagreeing with her husband. But it's also so clear that she, just like John, see what could happen if you don't let this republic expand. Right. If you don't remember the ladies, but also I took it as like, you know, not just ladies, but also African-Americans, Native Americans. Right. If you sort of read between the lines, it's not really what she's thinking about, but that's sort of what is going to be. It foreshadows the turmoil of the first couple decades of the American Republic. And that's why it's my favorite letter. But also, if you read that letter with an eye to how the women's reform movement sort of happened in the 19th century, that's sort of how you get like, you know, this feel of like white women specifically, because African-American women don't have like a lot of power at this time, find new and exciting ways to push their agendas in America, even if they don't have the vote. So that's why it's my favorite letter. But also it's because she's like, you know, John, get over your shit. So
that is very much an on-brand capsulization there. That would be a good tagline. But I will tell you why I like it, which is for slightly geeky manuscript reasons, which I hope we'll all appreciate as a documentary editor. But also because as you're right, as you just pointed out, it kind of starts in the middle of an argument. So she says, you know, I wish you would ever write me a letter half as long as I write you. That's the first sentence. You're immediately in it, right? Like you absolutely know that you have stumbled into a conversation, which is often how it feels, like eavesdropping when you're reading their letters. And then the next paragraph, what she does is immediately talk about her concerns about the military prowess of these revolutionaries. You know, she's worried that the Virginia militia is not as good or as strong as it can be. And she specifically raises the question that, you know, why would anyone in Virginia who owns enslaved people then fight for the cause of liberty? Is this something New England can count on? So this is really interesting because this tells us Abigail has some really sensitive military intel, first of all, right? She understands this, and this is because she's writing back and forth to John from the Continental Congress. He is very much her confidant, and she's getting a lot of information from him, that she has some strong regional affiliations and understandings of what's going on in the revolution. And then after she has spent another couple of paragraphs kind of looping him in to what's going on the farm, what they're going to plant in Quincy, and how the British officers have trashed their house in Boston, which she is not happy about because Abigail is a very strict property owner. And then, this is the geeky manuscript part, the whole passage that you're talking about comes probably about 3/4 down on the second page of a long, like legal size paper, right? So she kind of buries it like 3/4 through, like she's hooked him with all the useful information, right? And then she's like, and you know, in the new code of laws you make, I desire you would remember the ladies, you know, and be more favorable to them than your ancestors. And if you don't, we'll foment a rebellion. And so what's interesting to me about this is a couple things. Often this is the moment where, when we're fortunate enough to show it again in person to, you know, history fans and teachers and students of all ages, people always say, well, how could a woman foment a rebellion in the 18th century? And, you know, that's a separate gallery talk that I also love to give. So that's an opportunity for conversation. But here's the part that I love as a scholarly editor. When you see this exact letter and it's digitized on the Massachusetts Historical Society website, what you'll notice is that Abigail, when she writes her letters, and she writes a lot of them, she's a drafter, right? So she kind of goes back, she changes a word, she carrots in some other one, she changes her mind. When you get to this paragraph, her pen never slips. It is sure and steady. So she is writing this stream of thought. But here's the thing it tells me as well. They've had this conversation before. So you really start to see from looking at the manuscript what the conversation is. And Varsha, I think this leads in nicely to your final point about the women's reform movement that's going to keep going right in the 19th century, which is, what are the conversations that husbands and wives are having about this, and what kind of material can we use to understand that arc? So a very long answer to your very sharp question.
Yeah, but that's why it's one of my favorite letters, is because you just see how clearly Abigail is thinking about all of this. I had a quick follow-up, and then we will talk about religion, because we haven't talked about it at all. But what, so you mentioned Massachusetts a lot, and Boston and stuff like that. What's the deal? You mentioned like the regional differences. What's the deal with Massachusetts colonists? And like, does John Adams and Abigail Adams sort of fall into that of like, we're sort of better than everybody, you know, city on a hill type of stuff? Does that sort of like tie into how they think about religion and how they think about America? Like, do Massachusetts Americans have like a different view of like America, specifically the Adams family, than others?
Why are Boston people so weird? That's the question.
Why are they uptight? Why do they know everything? You know, why are they better than everybody? Why do they think they're better than everybody? It starts early. It starts early.
As a native New Yorker, I need to know this. So
yeah.
So as a native of Brooklyn, New York, who's lived in Boston for some time, I will say I have always found them warm and welcoming. I do find that because of the very early roots, right, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, yeah, there's a great, deep, serious interest in history, and that's all to the good when you work at a place like the Historical Society. But to put a really fine point on the Adamses, oh yeah, they loved that they could point to Puritan ancestry. They absolutely use that. So John Adams is really good about this. He has this incredible kind of backstory about his own Anglo-American ancestors, and he really mines it for all the political work that he can. When he's building arguments about revolution in his Novanglis letters, he very explicitly points back to Puritans and said, look what they were capable of. They raised themselves up, they educated themselves, they crossed an ocean, they said no and dissented from the tyranny of the church and the state. We could do that again. Like, so it's really important to kind of call up that New England ancestry in the Revolutionary period because it legitimates the revolution. So that's certainly something they do over and over. And then once they're kind of that Revolutionary era figures like John Adams, once they're in power, it helps to say, you know, we go back to this country a couple generations, like we were farming this land for some time. That's a great kind of political stance to take when you're currying favor with voters. John Quincy Adams uses it quite effectively as well. So yeah, absolutely they use it. Abigail is incredibly proud of her ancestry. What's interesting about the Adamses is that John and Abigail both kind of gesture back to this great Puritan heritage. They're not wholly right. Their genealogy is a little fuzzy. And so they're not quite sure like what part of England they might be from, or at one point Abigail thinks that she might have kind of royal ancestry when she's in London. Like they're very kind of confused about it, but proud. And I know certainly that scholars like Karen Wolf are unpacking this, you know, this idea of genealogy and how it's related to political opportunities in the early republic.
Yeah. I do want to ask if I can, I want to get to make sure we have some really great questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we have time for that, you know, in the second half, the drunk with historians part of the show. But I do want to follow up about religion, because, you know, your really wonderful book, Household Gods, the Religious Lives of the Addams Family, which I think that's the correct title. Is that correct? Yeah. So, and there's something about studying religion, both in kind of American history generally, but in early Americas, which I think is becoming more common, but hasn't been historically. And I'm saying this kind of as an outside observer. And if I can draw kind of a modern parallel, is that one of the things you see in an analysis of the January 6th sedition is that there's a lot of attention being paid to the symbols that were there. Right. But one of the things that some reporters are kind of pointing out is that there's a lot of religious imagery there as well. But it's something that seems to be kind of buried, or people are uncomfortable understanding how politics and religion kind of fit into the American experience. And that's true historically. So what was it like what was it like, very briefly, kind of for the Adams themselves? And what was it your experience in doing this kind of research and talking about how religion actually kind of matters to this particular family?
So thanks. This book was born of a dissertation, and it was not the one I originally planned to write. So I'll be fully honest by saying that. I had a very nice kind of tidy story about revolutionary Anglicanism and colonial Boston, and you know, that seemed like the way to go. And then I was at really my first month in the Adams papers, and I was doing something that everybody does when they do historical research, whether you are decoding your grandmother's letters or you are, you know, first time in the archive, and that's transcription. And I was transcribing John Adams' letter books, and he was being kind of old and particularly, shall we say, prickly, and recounting his role and his legacy, kind of reflecting back. So it was old John Adams that I was reading. And he wrote a letter talking about, you know, what was it that had really helped his family to survive for so long? Because at that point, they'd been there over a century. And so he was reasonably proud of this, and he was trying to figure it out. And he wrote this letter, and he said, I believe it is. And at this moment, I actually did the like flip of the letter book page, like I had the actual moment. And he said, religion, without which they would have been, you know, just out of this world. They would never have mattered. And I thought, well, really, John Adams? And I thought, like, here he's trying to throw me a lead. So let me see if I can chase it down the centuries and figure out if religion really was a force that kept them going, kept them productive as politicians, as cultural critics, as artists, as everything else. And so I started chasing it down the generations. And what I found was exactly what you said, Matt. You don't always get American history with the religion left in. But when you do leave it in, you really get to complicate the presentation of some very famous people's lives, right? You start to look at some very familiar actors. What we like to always say is, it's the familiar made strange. But the Adamses grew very strange indeed when I thought about them through the context of religion.
Yeah.
It just wasn't always about kind of, Christian citizenship and how the two went together. I had these amazing sources. I had letters and diaries and photographs, all kinds of things to look through. And I thought, aha, with John and John Quincy Adams, I'll be able to see they read these Bible verses according to their diary, and then they went to work and they voted this way on this policy, and that will help me draw a straight line. It did not. The line went wavy. That was interesting. The second thing that happened was that I fully expected in 3 centuries of Adamses that they would comment on the big things that happened. So I was going to get comments on the First and Second Awakening. They were going to agonize over the Civil War a lot for me. That did not always happen. So the hinges of my story kind of fell off, and I had to make new hinges, because the things that they often commented on were what happened locally. John Adams planned to be a preacher, which I think we're all glad he didn't, and went on to become something that he thought was much friendlier, which was a lawyer. And so he didn't make that life choice easily. He made it because he saw a local preacher his own age treated really badly by the community. So all the stories that I thought I was going to tell changed, and my understanding of American history and how religion kind of makes those milestones changed as well. So it made me teach differently. It made me write differently. It made me remember that local history is sometimes the bigger thing in people's lives than national history. And that was really important to understand.
That's absolutely amazing, and I want to get to audience questions, but just to follow up on this, is that's such a quintessential historian experience, isn't it? You go into the archive, expecting something, and you find something totally different, and you get these really important historical sources which you think will be talking about X, and then, like in my medieval case, they're talking about fucking crop yields. Right. It's just it's just incessant. It's just like, okay, man, all right, in Septimania, the crops were great in 873. Fantastic. What else was going on? But that's what really mattered to them. Right. So, yeah. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead, Varsha.
Okay, so I know I was going to ask audience questions, and I will. I definitely will. I just have to mention. So the thing is, when I studied U.S. history, when I took the surveys in high school and in college, the Adams that I loved was not Abigail Adams or John Adams. It was John Quincy Adams, because this dude, in my own words, was a badass. Okay, so not only is he the son of the second president, he goes on to be Secretary of State, then he goes on to be president, and then after he's president, he comes back to the House. He hasn't had enough. So I guess my question is, do you agree with the term badass? And when you study John Adams, John Quincy Adams, what stands out to you? What does he draw from his father and mother, and what's totally new? Does he surpass his father in terms of when he becomes president and in his political career?
Well, I think he'd love that you called him that, but secretly, to your face, he'd be pretty horrified and very stoic about it. He has a really interesting arc, John Quincy Adams. He's just this remarkable teenager who has his first diplomatic gig, right? He goes to Russia, as a teenager. He's a translator. He shows up at Catherine the Great's court. She has no interest in him, but he does have a great lost weekend in Sweden that you can read about. But he has this fantastically interesting kind of beginning to his life, where you have to remember, he's a teenager in Passy, right outside Paris, and kind of the guys in the house that he hangs out with, who are his dad's sometimes friends, are Jefferson and Franklin. Think about that, Jefferson, Franklin, Lafayette. That's who you grow up with when you're.
That's so cool.
Right?
You're so lucky.
You're very lucky. And the person who never let him forget that was his mother, Abigail. So there's a wonderful letter after he's, had some kind of rudimentary instruction at Leiden, and he swans back to the States. And he enters Harvard kind of as a junior. And the first thing Abigail says to him in the letter is, you have never had a book denied to you, or, access to a brilliant mind. Don't be a blockhead. we love the blockhead letter, and I use it a lot because it's just very maternal, but very stern. And I think his mother's voice is very much in his head throughout his life, which is interesting to see. That said, his political career, he's determined that he will not make the same mistakes that his father does. He makes some of the same and some new ones. And so he has a very promising start to his diplomatic career. As you say, he has a pretty checkered presidency. He's kind of got a bigger brain for the job than the actual kind of nuts and bolts of the presidency. He has these great plans for internal improvements and everything else. He doesn't necessarily play well either with party politics. And he does make more of a name for himself in his great second act as a congressman, which is really worth thinking about. I mean, the last great crusade of his life is anti-slavery. And that's really just something to explore in his diary. I know that Mark Mason and David Waldstreicher have a wonderful kind of edited collection of that. You can also read it in our digital edition of the diary. You can see kind of the transcript as well as the actual manuscript itself on the Historical Society website. What's interesting about his last crusade is that it's very hard won. He's not sure he's up for it. He quite literally writes in his diary, like, I'm old, feeble, toothless. How could I possibly go up against this? So he is certainly turning back to his, and I think this goes to Matt's question, his Christian conscience. He thinks that's the thing that powers him on, that sense of responsibility, really in his final years as well. So JQA would love that you called him that, but he'd be a little shy about it, maybe.
But I mean, the reason, just for the viewers, the reason I call him that is like he literally dies in the House chamber, right? He literally is there's a speech or there's a question being asked. The Speaker of the House asks, does everybody want to like support the veterans of the U.S.-Mexican War? And every congressperson is like, yes, we do. And like, he's like, no, F that. And he's like responding to the speech. And then like he has a stroke like an hour later. And like he dies next to his wife in the House chamber.
He has a stroke. He is removed to the side room. That's all true. He very much, the newspapers report that he died in harness. So
what does that mean?
Kind of like a workhorse, kind of chained to the cause to the end. Nice. So I always kind of think of that when I think of him. And I have to say, like, of all that, you have kind of a sensory world of the Adamses. He talks so much and so frequently and gave so many lengthy orations. I always wonder what his voice sounded like. Like if I could hear an Adams, I would want to hear him. It was such an age of kind of golden rhetoric in American politics, that antebellum period. I would love to know, like, what timbre was it? Was he more of a tenor? Like, these are the things that rattle around in a documentary.
In my brain, yeah. Okay, so first audience question, and then, Matt, you can ask one. I think it's a lot of people are asking this. Did John Adams, the first, did he attend Jefferson's inauguration, right? Like, Trump is not willing to attend Biden's, Hillary Clinton attended Trump's. Like, when did that tradition begin where like the old president attended the new president's inauguration? Did Adams, take it in tow, and did he attend?
So Adams lights out pretty quick, right? It's just dawn the morning of the inauguration. He does not stick around. He's been eager to get home. Abigail has already gone ahead. Generally where Abigail goes, John goes. And so he is eager to leave. He's not really interested in sticking around. We have a really interesting idea about the pomp and circumstance, I think, of presidential inaugurations, much of it born around the time of John F. Kennedy's inauguration, right? Televised, glamorous, a poet laureate. It's not quite the same thing in the 18th and 19th century. It's more of it's a little bit quieter as an affair. Did it matter very much that Adams didn't stick around? Not really. It's one of those things that just kind of happened. Now, John Quincy, there's a wonderful passage in his diary where, he also doesn't stick around for Andrew Jackson's inauguration, which has its own set of stories related to it. And you need a Jackson scholar or Jackson Papers editor to mind that one. But I will say briefly that there's a wonderful passage in his diary for March 4th for that day, where usually JQA gets up, he reads 10 books, he goes for a swim, like he does a million things. He's that guy in the morning. And the morning of Jackson's inauguration, it's like he sleeps in, he does some errands in town, and then on his way home, like an express rider passes him and says, "Excuse me, sir, like, you know who John Quincy Adams is because I have a letter for him." And JQA is like, "Yeah, it's me." Like he's already kind of off the history. But what's so poignant is then he wrote down the whole story in his diary, which is like, why would you do that? It's so mortifying. And it's because in the Addams family, you read your dad's diary, you read your mom's letters. Like that was your training for civic life. So they always write for the archive. They're always writing down what's good, what's bad, everything in between, which is fascinating to read.
Whoa, that's amazing. I never thought of presidents or, you know, politicians writing for the archive. I mean, obviously, you know, there are times when you're writing in your journal and you're like, yeah, this is going to be for the archive. But like, I didn't realize that people actually did that. That's fascinating. It's very narcissistic, but fascinating nonetheless.
But just a different conception of privacy, right? Is that about what's private and what's public? Like, I think that those things, you know, we think that there's oftentimes a hard and fast distinction between them, but really there isn't sometimes, right? So it certainly seems like what you were saying, the Addams, they're very aware they're public figures. And although it's internal to the family, perhaps they're aware that they are, you know, people are going to read these things. So
they do, and it's not always to their great political gain, right? So John Adams' letters get intercepted and printed. He has some particularly nasty things to say about John Dickinson that, and I quote John Adams here, "piddling genius," end quote. You know, these are not things that you want to show up in the press. And once they've shown up a bunch of times, John Adams also takes it pretty hard in the press. He's also kind of given all this smattering of names. He's called old and fat and toothless. Because he is involved in a patronage system. One of my favorite nicknames that he gets slammed with in the press is Daddy Vice, because while he's vice president, I knew that's for you, Varsha. I thought you'd enjoy that.
That's amazing.
John Quincy is on the rise. So yeah, so there's a lot. Abigail, they call the old woman in the press. So, you know, you have to think about
Sexist.
kind of pressure people
Not
are
funny.
under.
Yeah.
They're under a lot, or the presidentess.
So if I could ask, I mean, like just transitioning a little bit, we did talk about one of the most important things, which is the Addams short miniseries on HBO that was there, and Paul Giamatti. But Michael asks, what are your thoughts on the musical 1776?
Love it, no regrets.
I mean, you were using gifs from it earlier, right? Is that right? Yeah. So I mean, so what are your thoughts on the portrayal of Adams specifically in 1776?
I mean, who's better? I'm not going to go down the road of who wore it best when it comes to donning the John Adams character, because they're all good pieces of art worth thinking about. What I think is so fascinating about 1776 and the miniseries, they're such time capsules of the era when they were made, right? I mean, if you want to understand, you know, America in the 1960s, 1970s, go to 1776. That's really helpful. The 90s, early aughts, that really tells you something, the HBO miniseries, which I think is so fantastic. But really, I do have kind of a soft spot for 1776 because it is here largely because of the Addams Papers editorial project. So much of that play is based on the first volumes that were coming out, the Addams Family Correspondence and John Adams' diaries. A lot of that kind of, you know, somewhat word for word is coming out of that first generation of work that our editorial project did. And it's exciting to be part of that kind of legacy in an odd way. We've had the good fortune whenever 1776 has a revival that actors often contact us. And I absolutely love sharing and viewing manuscripts with actors and artists, because I think artists approach an archive in ways that we don't, right, as historians. And it's so amazing to kind of think alongside them when we can.
I had a question.
Wait, hold on. No, I need to follow up on this. How do artists and actors approach an archive?
So here's something that I was asked that I never really thought about, which was, you know, how would this letter have been physically transmitted to John Adams while he was sitting in the Continental Congress? Okay, so if we all remember from junior high when you made those cool little triangle things to pass notes, I'm just saying that maybe we did that. Would a letter
not admitting anything, but just suggesting. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Would it have been folded up like that? Would it have been addressed? What would it look like? Like, how long would it take the motion of Adams to open a letter? Would he have done it in front of other people? Would he have written? Like, these were things I did not really think about, like how my actor was on a stage. Like, I didn't really consider that as much. I thought about the flow of information, but I didn't think about like the moment of receiving it. And that was really interesting. Like, how would people have created these manuscripts and reacted to them? And that intentionality is so vibrant to listen to. Or, you know, there's a series of letters where Adams is getting really bad news from Abigail, like, how soon did he reply? Like, what, you know, these are the kinds of things that they're really interested in. And that helps because we don't think that way always.
I had a question from a viewer before the episode started. He just asked me, just in case he couldn't get the Q&A in. He was wondering why you decided to work for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and do you get a chance to talk to grad students ever? Do you get a chance to advise them when it comes to looking at the Adams paper or dealing with history of Massachusetts?
Well, I work for the nation's oldest historical society because it's awesome. Because it's kind of like a history lab or workshop, kind of ever evolving. But how did I get there? As a researcher, I went in to work in the reading room with the Old North papers. And when a job opened up for library assistant, I completely switched careers and started over and moved to the Adams Papers editorial project and kind of worked my way up there while doing grad school full-time and working full-time. Which is a fun challenge. But I love talking to grad students, and we have plenty of them in our reading room. We have some as interns. We are always glad to kind of talk to graduate students. I love to hear what they're working on, because when you work in an archive for so long, it's great to hear somebody else's take on it. People will just come in with something that, you know, I never thought of before, just a completely fresh take. And we're ready for that. I think the archive reacts well to new spotlights.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely one of the most exciting parts of doing archival work, but just kind of doing intellectual work generally is the moments when you get to hear somebody else take like their take on something, because and then like to have that kind of conversation, because sometimes even with stuff that you've been working on for so long, like just having a pair of fresh eyes on that. Like, I mean, like what you were saying about the actors, like asking these physical questions, these questions about kind of the physicality, the materiality of these objects, like how were they used? What did you do with them? But then having somebody read this something differently and just ask a different question from a different perspective. I think that's absolutely exciting. And that happens sometimes in the classroom. Sometimes it happens in conversations like with colleagues, and sometimes it happens in the archive. It can happen kind of anywhere. And if you're open to that, like that's the excitement of history, at least to me. So
pro tip to anybody researching the 1970s or 1980s, wear a t-shirt from the Nixon Presidential Library that says Nixon's the one, because a bunch of old white dudes who lived during the Nixon administration or the Reagan administration will come up to you and be like, I love that shirt. And then they'll ask you what you're researching. And then you get like sort of like an oral history right then and there. You can't do that for the 19th century, but just pro tip, you know, make yourself like sort of stand out to the old people in an archive, because they will come up to you, and it's great. So. Do
you need IRB approval for that, or is that like I mean
yeah, but it happened multiple times. It was my favorite shirt to wear to the archive, and like I just loved wearing that shirt. It was like nobody got that it was ironic unless you're on the Berkeley campus. No one gets that it's an ironic shirt. So when you're wearing it out in the world, everyone's like, whoa, it's a Richard Nixon fan there. And so the type of people who will come up to you are very unique. But yeah, that on that point, that's why I love the archives, because you get to talk to a ton of different people. A really great question two people have asked is, you mentioned biographies of John Adams and Abigail Adams. What are some biographies you would recommend to people of those two, or of John Quincy Adams?
Sure.
Other than, of course, Sarah's own amazing book.
Yeah,
which you
other than your book. Other than your book.
So, yes.
So first, our editions, because I always think the Adams' own words, which are free and available to read, are a good way to go. And certainly John Adams loves to tell you all about his life and his diary. obviously household gods. But I would also say when it comes to John Adams, I do like The Party of One book by Jim Grant. I think David McCullough's John Adams is a fantastic introduction to the family and the era. And it is, of course, based on the Adams papers and his research there. So I think that actually is a great kind of window into understanding the period. So see the miniseries, but read the book. And then delve into the primary sources. And Abigail, I think Woody Holton's biography is fantastic because you really see this other side of Abigail as a savvy bond speculator, right? We wouldn't quite call it insider trading, but she's certainly very adroit at knowing how politics and speculation can move in tandem in the early republic. And you get a really interesting view of her from that. In terms of John Quincy Adams, I'm thinking of recent work by Phyllis Lee Levin on kind of his early education. And as I mentioned before, his diary, which is a wonderful thing to read because he has exquisitely beautiful handwriting. It's so beautiful that someone has created a font out of it, which I love. So
wow.
See, I bring the geeky manuscript facts.
That's the dream. Can you imagine like somebody makes a font out of your handwriting? That's amazing.
Isn't that awesome?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, like, I think I love that you keep coming back. I mean, you know, I'm sure this is not at all inspired by your position in your job or anything like that, but coming back to the primary sources, because I think it's so essential. And it's really, it's the excitement of doing history, right? Is looking at that material and for yourself and being able to think about it, you know, with fresh eyes, or maybe to just revisit some older questions or something like that. You can't do that without being able to access those materials. Also, just the reality of I long for the moment to be in an archive and to the smells and the tactile experience of holding things like. Ooh, I'm very excited about getting back to that someday. So
last question, speaking of archive, Rachel, our awesome assistant, brought this up, and I just wanted to ask it because I'm obsessed with the French Revolution. But apparently you wrote an article for the Smithsonian about how the key to the Bastille ended up to George Washington. Like George Washington had the key to the Bastille. How did that happen? How did you figure that out? Why did he have it? Like, what's going on? Like, I just want to know. I just have to know.
I mean, read the story. But I would say, first of all,
read the syllabus, guys. Read the syllabus. Yeah, sorry.
But to answer your question very briefly, I found that out and I thought I've got to go to Mount Vernon and see it. And the Mount Vernon staff and curators and the amazingly helpful folks at the Fred Smith Library were so kind to kind of walk me through all the 18th and 19th century sources for that key, which hangs, you know, just where it hangs, but was originally displayed by Washington. It was kind of George Washington's one artifact blockbuster show that he put on as president at one of his levees, one of his kind of weekly parties. And I mean, it just fascinated me. Like, why was it here? The more I dug, I realized like there were a bunch of keys to the Bastille. So like there are a bunch of people who got a key to the Bastille. That was probably the most famous one. And there's kind of a link of people. I believe it was Price and then also Lafayette, who were involved in this kind of delivery system across the Atlantic. But thinking about what that meant, what the French Revolution meant in that moment, versus what it was about to do, just to everything that we just talked about, right? The splintering of the Federalist Party, to the questions about how you peacefully transfer power. These are all things that are also bubbling away in France at the same time. So I was just fascinated with why it was there. I mean, I often start a Smithsonian story that way, with an object or a manuscript that I'm like, but why was that thing doing that there? Like, I just don't get that. Like, I'm struggling to make a connection between the source and the scholarship. And somewhere in between is that secret sauce of interpretation that we have, right, as historians, hence the scholarship and the intervention. So it's a lot of fun to do. But yeah, don't you want to know about all the random French Revolutionary artifacts and where they're scattered? Yeah. I do.
Okay, last question before I let you go, because it just popped into my head. What did the Adamses family in general think about the Haitian Revolution in comparison to the French Revolution? Because they're from Massachusetts. I'm assuming they're not pro-slavery. Like John Quincy Adams wasn't pro-slavery. Like, did they have any thoughts about the Haitian Revolution?
Varsha, ask me next week because I'm literally annotating this right now for the Papers of John Adams, Volume 21.
Oh.
So either you directly have, my boss asked you to ask that, so thank you, Sarah Martin. But I will say that their information is sketchy. So we always think like, oh, someone's going to comment knowledgeably. Not so much, right? Information is trickling in. In fact, John Quincy Adams writes a letter of recommendation to his father for someone who's a wealthy French planter who's worried and fleeing and losing his land. This guy's going to come back around in the XYZ affair. He's going to boomerang back in a slightly different way. So stay tuned is all I can tell you on that one.
Oh man. Okay, so we gotta. Okay, so everybody let's follow Sarah on Twitter. So
this is like this is like ending on a cliffhanger. This is amazing.
I know.
This is
need
wonderful.
to know.
Yeah. So I think unfortunately we do unfortunately have to end on a cliffhanger because we just are about out of time, and I'm realizing like I haven't drank in a while, so I've been drinking for a while. But thank you so much, Sara Georgini, for joining us. Thank you all, everyone, for joining us on the beginning of season 2 of Drinking with Historians. We will be back in 2 weeks with Carlos Noreña, who's a historian of ancient Rome, but also is doing some amazing comparative work with Han China as well. Let me also give a shout out to our amazing researcher and assistant, Rachel, who has been behind the scenes helping us out and has just been a wonderful addition to the Drinking with Historians crew. But until next time, thank you again, Sarah. This has been an absolutely phenomenal one. And like, I need to read your piece, right? I need to find out about the Haitian Revolution now and the Adams people. So that's going to happen, right?
Usually what happens after these interviews is or after Drinking these stories, like go buy the book from the person I interview. I think now I'm gonna go buy not just your book, but I think I'm gonna try to find all these diaries and like read them. So
you can go online and read them for free digital editions on the Massachusetts Historical Society.
Very excited.
You're giving away free history? Are you serious? In this economy? That's crazy. It
belongs to all of us.
That's right. That's absolutely right. That's why we're doing this.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Let me leave you with this, and let me simply say to everybody, cheers.
Cheers.